This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 139 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to go step by step through the process of planning a project-based learning lesson. Project-based learning gets more popular every year, and that's a good thing. We want our students to take what they learn and actually do something with it, rather than just receiving a load of information, regurgitating it on tests, and promptly forgetting it. But PBL is only a good thing if we're doing it right. And unfortunately, the likelihood of that happening consistently is very low. That's because a term like project-based learning is easy to misinterpret. A science teacher could, for example, have students choose a famous scientist to research and create trifold boards where they paste photos and facts about their person, date and place of birth, most significant accomplishment and discoveries, family life, date of death. This kind of project happens all the time in schools, but it does not come close to true project-based learning. In my own exploration of PBL, I have never felt like I quite got it 100%. I could sort of tell you what it was, but if you asked me to design a PBL unit, I would honestly be guessing half the time. I think the reason is that I've never really seen it in action. I get the philosophy behind PBL, but I've never seen an entire unit from start to finish. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to walk through a PBL unit that's designed to take about 6 to 8 weeks. We'll talk about the teacher's goals and the standards they wanted to address. We'll look at how they envisioned the final projects, the assessment tools they put in place, and the lessons they plan to make it all happen. Our guide is PBL expert Jenny Pieratt. Through her website, Crafted Curriculum, Jenny offers tons of resources to help teachers implement powerful project-based learning in their classrooms. The lesson we're going to walk through today comes from her new book, Keep It Real with PBL. What's so great about the book and our interview is that Jenny is so realistic about the process. She's not trying to get teachers to completely change everything they're doing or abandon the things that are already working in their classrooms. And because she's worked with so many teachers, she understands exactly where people can get hung up in the process. We're going to be getting into a lot of detail here, so as you listen, keep in mind that Jenny also wrote a full blog post over on Cult of Pedagogy that describes this same process and links out to a lot of other downloads and other resources that'll help you get started with planning a lesson of your own. To find it, just go to cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and then find episode 139. Before we get started, I would like to thank Pear Deck for sponsoring this episode. Knowing the basics of good digital citizenship is essential for today's kids, and far too important to be stuck behind a paywall. That's why Pear Deck teamed up with Google to help your students be Internet awesome. The Be Internet Awesome curriculum is designed to teach kids how to be safe, more confident explorers of the online world, and it's all free. Just download the interactive Pear Deck presentations that accompany each Be Internet Awesome lesson. They're easy to tailor to your student's grade level and designed to introduce a concept related to digital citizenship while enjoying fun and engaging activities. Even better, Pear Deck is offering my listeners a complimentary 60-day premium trial. Just head to peardeck.com/cultofpedagogy now to redeem the offer and check out the Be Internet Awesome lessons. Support also comes from Participate. Participate is an online social learning platform that connects adult learners, scales learning initiatives, and strengthens organizational impact all in one place. Trusted by school districts, nonprofits, and edtech organizations across the nation, Participate takes existing professional learning initiatives and provides a digital community that encourages real engagement and collaboration around those goals. To receive a brief guide highlighting the community building process and links to a few of Participate's favorite social learning communities, such as Teach the Global Goals, visit go.participate.com/cultofpedagogy. That's go.participate.com/cultofpedagogy. You'll find a lot of these principles are applicable to establishing more meaningful connections to your students as well. Now, here's my interview with Jenny Pieratt about project-based learning. I would like to welcome Jenny Pieratt to the podcast. Jenny, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited. You and I have been emailing for probably, 3 years now, and we're finally sitting down and doing a podcast. So I'm really, really excited. We are going to break down uh, a PBL lesson for people step by step so that, if people have heard about it and maybe they've kind of messed it up or not really been sure how to do it, we're going to really take them through an entire lesson piece by piece. And you are like the go-to for this type of a thing. So introduce yourself a little bit to my listeners and tell them a bit about what you do.
I mean, in a nutshell, I guess I would just say PBL is kind of my jam. I mean, I've been doing it for a long time. I was a founding staff member at High Tech High, and that was kind of where I got my legs with PBL. And then I just kind of developed my own flavor for it over time, working in a few different PBL organizations. And really just arrived at doing the work I do now, supporting teachers with it in terms of design and professional development.
Awesome. And you do a lot of that through your website primarily too. A lot of that stuff is online. And let's just give them the name of your website.
Yeah, you can learn more about my work at craftedcurriculum.com.
Great. So before we break down this lesson, give us just a definition of what project-based learning actually is, because a lot of people have sort of different ideas. And then let's talk a little bit about why people struggle with getting it right.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any one real answer for PBL, and I think it should be a little bit different for everybody. I think it should be relevant to the context in which teachers are designing. So, what's authentic to one community is going to be different to another community. For me, I definitely have my non-negotiables, and this would even be, debated by some people too. But for me and in the schools that I'm working in, projects need to be grounded in standards, because that's the reality that most teachers are living in, where they're being held to certain standards and they're being asked to assess those standards. So assessment is another really critical component for me when I'm designing a project, and really is a non-negotiable as well. And then I've kind of generally mentioned this already, but it needs to be authentic to a community. So it has to bring those standards to life for students. When we sit down to design a project and I ask a teacher, well, why would a student care about this? If we get stuck, that's usually kind of our first indication that maybe this isn't the place to turn that into a project, because it really needs to be something that has some real world context, whether it be an issue or a problem that students can grapple with and really see that it transcends outside of the classroom.
Got it. Was there one more? The 21st?
Yeah. I mean, it needs to have 21st century skills too. And this one just kind of organically comes up. I guess that's why I didn't call it out. But, most people would tell you that they're interested in project-based learning because of that component of collaboration or agency, which we all know is so important for students to develop. So even without trying, it happens in PBL. But so I almost don't even need to call it a non-negotiable, because it comes up. But 21st century skills would be another important component to how I define high quality project-based learning.
Great. Okay, so what we're going to do is, and you work with a lot of schools, so we are going to sort of walk through a fifth grade project-based unit plan, basically. And so if you could, I guess, start by talking a little bit about what these teachers were hoping to achieve, and then we'll start going through the process that you took them through.
Yeah, so this crew at Lake Elementary in Vista is an incredible group of 4 fifth grade teachers. And, they're tasked with teaching the American Revolution, which we all know is really important for students to learn about. But when I ask them, well, why does a student need to know about this? Why would they care? It's tough to give me an answer that sounds exciting, right, to a fifth grader. So we really set out to try to find something that would make the American Revolution feel relevant to students, where they could see themselves in it and really be engaged in content that has, traditionally been tricky to bring to life for kiddos.
Tell us what the first step is. If that was what they were trying to achieve, then what is the first thing that you would do when planning a project-based learning unit?
So when we sit down together, I guess even just to back it up one more step is, a lot of teachers will always say, like, I have no idea where to get started. Like, it's so overwhelming, right? And so I say, start with what I call your driving standards, which for me are social studies and science. And it doesn't mean that ELA and math and your other standards aren't important, but those are two really nice drivers. Like they just provide this context that the other content areas can support. So if you're a standalone teacher, it doesn't mean, and you don't teach social studies or science, it doesn't mean that that's not, the other content areas aren't important.
Right.
But if you're looking to collaborate with someone, they can kind of drive your planning. Similarly for elementary teachers who teach everything, it's like, where do I even start? So in this case, we had previously designed a couple of NGSS projects, and they're like, we really need to kind of just like bring the flavor over to social studies too. So that was kind of how we landed on. We started with social studies, and then we just looked at all the big ideas, like the big themes in their standards. And they're like, man, American Revolution, like that's one area that we just haven't done it justice. Like that really needs to be where we rethink how we're teaching that content. So we sit in front of like a big whiteboard, and we just throw up ideas. Like we get them all out, and it's a big mess. Like, okay, what are some like subtopics within the American Revolution? Like what's really going on? And we kind of break that down, and then we just start to try and draw lines to somehow connect those like subtopics to things that are happening either at school, in the local community and the global community, things people have seen on social media, something they saw while they were driving to school. Sometimes it's, things that teachers are particularly passionate about. And then we kind of have to tease out like, well, I know that's important to you, but is that going to be important to, a 12-year-old? So we just kind of go through that messy process. But, in short, it's getting everything out there that we can to connect the standards to a real world issue. And we just throw it up on the board. And then we start to we always take a picture of our mess. And then we start to peel away and start, erasing things that we don't love as much. And it's almost like this process of elimination of what's left when everything's taken away. What do we feel like is the most authentic connection of the standards to something that kids are going to care about most?
I think this is what you're describing is probably a really important first takeaway for people to realize that they're not going to just sit down and say, okay, here are the standards, and then this is what we're going to do. Like they should embrace that messiness at the beginning, because they'll probably end up with something way, way better at the end if they can do that, if they can sort of loosen up this idea that they're going to have the perfect thing right away.
Yeah, and I think too, collaborating with your colleagues is so important for this step. And that can look like different colleagues. Like it doesn't always have to be someone who teaches your exact same thing. When I taught humanities, and I remember the first project tune we did, the math and science teachers came in, and I was like, what are they doing here? And then it ended up being the best feedback I got on my project, because it really pushed me outside of my own thinking. Yeah. So I feel like also being okay with it being super messy and uncomfortable, because it might be people you're not used to collaborating with, that's going to bring a new perspective that's so rich to what you'll ultimately build out in a project.
Yeah. Did you say project tune?
Yeah, it's a project tuning protocol we used to always do at High Tech High.
Okay. I love that term. That's a fantastic term. So this is the idea of really thinking sort of deeply about, why do we even teach this stuff to begin with, and how do we make it relevant? It's not going to be this weird artificial connection. It's going to be something that's really deep and authentic to students.
Yeah, and I hate to say this, but not everything is going to happen that easily. Like there's a good amount of content where it's like, if I ask you why they have to learn, okay, like for example, in first grade, like the moon. When I ask you, why do students need to know about the moon? Your answer is like, well, because you need to understand the moon, right? Like, but I'm like, but why would a first grader care about that? Like there's some standards that are really difficult to figure out that real world context. And so I always remind teachers that like, unless you're in a school that's being asked to do PBL wall to wall, you don't have to do everything in a project. So you could only do like 1, 2, 3 projects in a year. And then in between those projects, you're doing inquiry-based learning or problem-based lessons. Like you're doing other approaches to teaching and learning that, yes, are still meaningful. So I always just say, start with an easy lift. Like start with where those easy real world connections are for building your project.
Man, I'm so glad that you said that last part there about, it doesn't have to be PBL all year long for every single topic, because I think that's probably another thing people struggle with, that they can't fit everything in organically. So that's probably not where they should be starting.
Yeah. And that also ties to the question of like, what does my day look like? And by no means do you have to be doing PBL all day in an elementary classroom. Like you still need to teach them how to read and write.
Right.
And it can still look traditional combined with, project work time maybe in the afternoon.
Right. So you're brainstorming with these fifth grade teachers about the American Revolution, and the goal is to figure out what the connections were, and then you actually landed on. Well, you're using backward design basically, so you're deciding on a final project, what the final project is going to look like. Correct?
Yeah, so through that brainstorming process, we kind of landed on this. We had this really cool moment of like, man, what's in the textbooks and what we traditionally study is very Eurocentric. Like we're looking at it from one perspective here.
Yep.
And, coming at it from a social justice angle, there was one teacher in particular that felt really passionate about we need to have some more diverse perspectives in here. And then it kind of turned into, well, yeah, that's really going to resonate with our students. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of identity issues happening in fifth grade, and they're really going to be able to connect to that, not being heard, and who's in power and who do we hear from. And so that was kind of the angle that it turned into. And so we said, well, what could we develop as a final product that would show their understanding of kind of this, yes, the historical context, but also how that ability to see different perspectives can show up in different contexts in our life. And so, yes, using UBD or backwards design, we decided on a few products, one being two voice poetry that would really showcase two different perspectives. Yes, how they're different, but also what they have in common. And then a student art piece. And when I say student art, I don't mean like arts and crafts and like this very fluffy thing. It was a very rigorous design of an art installation, really. And so they would take everything they had learned over the course of this project and showcase it in a really beautiful piece of stylized work at the end that would be grounded in the history and grounded in everything that they learned. And you would be able to see those connections symbolically in their work, but also in an artist statement that would be shown with the final piece.
Got it. So I'm going to just sort of review before we move to the next step. They take the standards. They really do a lot of brainstorming about how this is going to really authentically connect with students' lives and what's going to matter. And so then from there, they pull out the idea that we're going to focus on hidden voices and empathy building. And then from that grows out these two final projects, the two voice poetry and the student art.
Yeah, and obviously that wouldn't be something they would jump into. It would be a lot of scaffolding that would be required to get them there. But
right, those are the end products. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and this is all still within the context of the American Revolution, which I know we're going to talk about that in a minute. It's for, sort of to get a greater depth of understanding of the American Revolution, also.
Yeah, okay. and from maybe a different perspective than they would have, otherwise have learned about it.
So they've got the end project sort of in mind now. And what is the next step after that?
This next step, I think, is probably the most important piece. And no one taught me this when I was doing PBL in my early days. I had to learn it the hard way. But I call it benchmarking your project. And I know that word has a lot of negative connotations for people. So some of the teachers I work with prefer to call it milestones or phases. Yeah. But really it's this idea of, the two final products I just described to you, if I were to describe that to a teacher without talking about benchmarking, it would be really overwhelming. They'd be like, oh, how do I get my kids there? Like, that's a big jump, right? Yeah. So the benchmarking is the baby steps that we take to get them to that final product. It's breaking it down into like these digestible chunks, not just for the students, but for you as a teacher to be able to figure out how you want to scaffold these phases and then ultimately formatively assess them to be sure that they're learning what they need to before you move forward in the project.
Right. So what we're going to do so that people can sort of picture these phases for this particular project is we're going to have you walk us through. You've got 5 different benchmarks, and 2 of them are actually doing the final projects, but then there's others that are built in. So if you could just sort of walk us through the steps of those benchmarks.
Yeah, so the first benchmark, and this is very typical. Most benchmark number 1s are background, like just getting them like the bare bones, the basics of what they need to continue to build off of for the rest of the project. So in this case, they needed some historical context. Like they needed to understand just the basics of the American Revolution, like what had caused what were the events leading up to the revolution. And to do that, the teachers had, generally decided that that would look like a few different things, but it would be ultimately up to each individual teacher how they wanted to go about every day's lesson. So, they decided they were going to do some lit circles, and they had agreed upon the same books as a grade level. They would do textbook reading like you traditionally would. They would watch some videos, maybe look at some pieces of artwork. And then the outcome or the deliverable for that first benchmark was actually just going to be a quiz. And I think that's really important to call out here, because I think in PBL it becomes really overwhelming for teachers because they feel like they have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and you don't. So the ways in which they traditionally taught the American Revolution are going to look pretty similar as that first benchmark. Like that first benchmark probably could have been the entire unit in their past life before they knew about PBL. Right? So you can keep all that stuff that you normally do. You don't have to, add on and make it in addition to. So that was kind of the first phase of the project. From there, once the students had kind of that foundational understanding, then they moved into more of diverse perspectives of those same events. So, benchmark 1 was from a pretty Eurocentric perspective, the way our textbooks read. Benchmark 2 was now looking at it from, whether it be Native Americans, white women, enslaved people, lower class, Chinese, people that we don't typically hear from in our textbooks, looking at those same events through short stories, still reading those same books for the literature circles. And then ultimately, their deliverable for that benchmark was going to be a narrative piece written from the perspective of one of those individuals. And it would just be like a day in the life of. So there's some kind of variables there too. Some teachers might choose to write and then voice record those, whereas others might just do more of a traditional narrative writing. So they would also need to scaffold narrative writing skills in that second benchmark so that students were prepared to produce that deliverable of a narrative writing piece.
Got it. So they have the basic Eurocentric background information, which you're right, would have been the whole unit probably before. They've done a quiz to make sure that they know it, but that is meant to be built on. They move into the second phase, which is learning about different perspectives, and then they do some narrative writing to represent what they learned about one particular perspective, right?
Yep.
Okay. And then
in benchmark 3, they kind of, so you're kind of seeing, right, that there's like layers here. So benchmark 3 is about adding on another layer and taking what they've learned in benchmark 1 and now benchmark 2 and comparing and contrasting those two things. So this is where they produce the first product here, which is the 2-voice poetry piece. So they look at models of 2-voice poetry. They do a very basic Venn diagram to kind of set the stage for it. And then they look at some more narrative writing techniques that they've learned previously to apply to their own work. And then they work alongside a peer who has a different perspective than theirs to produce this piece of work. And again, there's some variance here too. Some teachers chose to just have them, type and print out their work, whereas others had decided to have the students record in GarageBand, which sounded really cool because the way it's set up is each student reads their differences, but then they read their similarities together. So it sounds really cool.
Nice. Okay, so that is now they're really starting to get into the final products. They're doing the 2-voice poetry, and then benchmark 4.
Yeah, and this takes kind of a cool twist. So this you can really see was a result of that brainstorming process. But we were like, okay, it's not enough for them to necessarily care about these diverse perspectives from the past. Like, we still need to bring it home for them, and we still need to make them see that this wasn't just about things that were happening, hundreds of years ago, but these same kinds of themes are showing up today. So benchmark 4 was about them talking about current issues and perspectives. So they started out creating a Google form where they surveyed their peers and community members to ask about what they saw around issues or problems in the community, and trying to kind of get that initial diverse perspectives on those issues, and doing some interviewing as well. And then the teachers grouped the students based off of which of those issues they wanted to dive further into. So that became what we call their special interest grouping. And that's a question I get a lot in PBL. How do I group my kids? So this is one way you could group them, is based off their interest or their topic that they wanted to research further. And then they did a lot of work around just discussing diverse perspectives using some visible thinking routines, Socratic seminar, to further understand how different people might be viewing the same issue or problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And from there, the students, and again, this was dependent upon the teacher. Some teachers decided to do like a very detailed graphic organizer of their findings,
Mm-hmm.
and other teachers decided to do an infographic where they would actually compile all their findings into like a really cool infographic that could be printed and showcased almost as its own final product if they wanted to.
Okay, got it. And this is really in preparation for, and actually let me ask this question because I'm remembering it in the writing that you did on this. How long are you allowing for each of these benchmarks?
That's a great question. And well, in this case, right? Like I can remember when we sat down, they had already learned narrative writing, and they had already learned like basic research skills. So, and the reason I say that is because when teachers ask about timing, I always have to say, well, is this project the vehicle for teaching that skill, or is this simply a review of some of the skills?
Got it.
Because that's going to dictate the timing. So
Mm-hmm.
in this case, usually each benchmark is about a week to 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Depending, I guess, on how many
And
skills need to be taught along with the content.
versus how much is a review,
Yeah.
right? So I remember, like in this case, going through, lit circles, it's going to take you like at least 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the historical background, that was like a week, which is benchmark one. Benchmark two was, I want to say, like a week and a half. Benchmark three went pretty quick. Like they did that in a couple of days, especially for elementary too, because you can be working on this. You can be pulling your ELA minutes and your social studies minutes, right? So like you can have a pretty big chunk of your day that's devoted to this.
Right.
And then benchmark 4 and 5, those each took a little bit more time because there was just a lot of nuances as the students kind of broke into their groups, that required more time.
Right.
So I think I want to say it was an 8-week project, which is on the longer end.
Okay.
I also think it's worth noting that this was their third project. So they had already been doing PBL for 3 years.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So everybody was able to probably dig in pretty confidently into the whole process.
Yeah, I think it's more common for someone's first project to be like 4 weeks.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, these are all really good numbers, I think, for people listening who aren't quite experienced enough yet to really have a good gauge of how long things take. So let's talk a little bit about moving on to benchmark 5. They've got a really good understanding now of a current issue and sort of where the silent voices are in that.
Yeah, and so then this last piece, we have like a county fair that opens up submissions for student work. And so the teachers decided that they wanted to actually use that as their authentic audience for the final product, which was an art submission or a piece of art. So this ended up being really a very rigorous benchmark for these students. They didn't have like a separate art class, so this was going to be kind of where they really dug into art for the year. But each teacher decided to pick one of 4 different types or mediums of art. So one teacher picked photography, one teacher picked digital art, one did painting, and one did pop art.
Mm-hmm.
And so the students could pick between one of those 4 styles, and they would then go with that teacher for, I want to say it was like a week, to do some in-depth studying, workshopping around that type of artwork. They would look at models, they would learn techniques. And the student's job was to take everything that they had learned from their research in benchmark 4 and to symbolically show diverse perspectives on the same issue in a piece of artwork. And then alongside that art piece would be an artist statement where they would talk about what inspired the artwork. They would, bring reference back to the American Revolution and the diverse perspectives that they had studied and how we can still see, their silenced voices that, needed to be elevated, and that art is one way that we can do that. So the artist statement really kind of brought it all together.
Mm-hmm.
But that final piece of art is what then was submitted for the county fair.
Got it. And you said earlier this is not like a little craft piece that's going to just be like the American Revolution. It sounds like it's much, much more advanced and thought through than that. So, um, I wanted to reiterate that this isn't even an art piece about the American Revolution at this point. It's about this current, or it's meant to represent the notion of a voice that is silenced in a current event, which is just a far more sophisticated idea than just pasting up some pictures from the American Revolution onto a trifold board.
Yes, and I think if we're not careful, it could very easily move into that. That's why I wanted to include all the different components from that benchmark 5 in the piece that I wrote for you, so that people could see, they were analyzing models, they were going through an in-depth critique process. Art can be so rich, if it's done well, and so this was really a beautiful opportunity for them to express themselves in a different way, because the teachers were like, gosh, they're doing all this writing, which is great. That is one form of expression. But at this age, this is the very end of the year for 5th grade. So they're about to go into middle school.
Yeah.
They're ready. They're ready to express themselves in other ways. And so this was just another way to kind of show their voice that we thought that, the students would really appreciate.
Got it. Okay. So once those 5 benchmarks have been established, what's the next step after doing that?
Taking a big breath, because that's a lot, and then coming into the assessment piece, which is also really important. So the benchmarking sets you up for your best practices of assessment just being embedded in your project. So the next big step is to build your project rubrics.
Okay. So what does that process look like? And we're not going to go into all of the standards or anything, but I want to make sure people can sort of picture developing a project rubric looks like.
Yeah, so we go back to the standards, and this is actually where we flesh out like the specific standards they want to assess, because like I mentioned, they're going to cover way more than they probably want to assess, because just by proxy, PBL covers so much. And a lot of it could just be review. So they might not feel like they need to actually do an in-depth assessment of content or skills that are simply reviewing a project. Like, for example, I mentioned researching. That was a review for them. They didn't want to assess it in this project, I don't think.
Okay.
So they go to the standards, flesh out exactly which ones, like which sub-standards even they want to assess. And then I like to just use a Google document as a table. I think it's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah.
And I have them just copy and paste the standard as it lives and drop it into the proficient box. So each content standard gets its own row on the rubric. And it's going to be this massive rubric, probably like, 6 to 8 rows.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to just describe actually what we're looking at too, because it's 3 columns. The first column being emerging, developing, the center being proficient, and then the far right being the advanced column. And you've got descriptors in all of those columns. And you're saying drop the standard into that center proficient column.
Yeah, and then I just have them like summarize like the big idea of the standard on the far left. So it'll say like social studies, causes of the American Revolution.
Got it.
And I have them drop it into proficient because your standards are grade level, like that is proficient, right? So that's our baseline. So they just copy and paste that, and then there's some blanks, which we'll talk about in a minute, that are going to be in the emerging and the advanced. So that's for their content standards. And then for the 21st century skills, there's some good rubrics out there that exist already. I love the ones that were designed by New Tech Network and Scale at Stanford. They're, all Common Core aligned. They're trusted, valid assessment tools. So I coach towards teachers using those open ed resources, which I've linked in the post for people to see. I'm yet to meet a teacher that doesn't love them when they see them.
Good.
And I have them just pull the rows from there that they like for the 21st century skills. And drop each of those into their corresponding boxes on the rubric as well. Okay.
So they're not meant to necessarily use everything in there. They're going to handpick what's a priority for this particular unit.
Yeah, which, like I said, they're gonna pull up. I guarantee, pull up those rubrics and be like, I want to put all of it in this project. Right. And I'm like, I know they're so great, but you just pull like one row from collaboration, one row from agency, because you already have so many rows dedicated to content. So then with those vacant boxes, going back up to the content standards, from there, what I do is I ask teachers to go back into the proficient box and bold the verb in the standard. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a visual for us that's really helpful, because now what needs to happen is we need to figure out what one level down from that standard is and one level up from that standard is to fill in those gaps in the rubric.
Okay.
So I have everybody pull up Bloom's taxonomy verbs, and again, guarantee it that the verb in the standards is going to drop right in the middle of Bloom's taxonomy.
Okay.
Every time.
Okay.
So then we can just look at the verbs, say for, a level down or two from there, to figure out how we want to phrase the emerging and developing box for that standard.
Okay.
And then similarly, we look to the verbs at the top of Bloom's to figure out how we want to rewrite the standard for an advanced child.
So you're setting up basically a massive single rubric for the entire, like in this case, 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, because we're planning with the end in mind still,
Right.
even with assessment.
Okay.
So we're talking about what students are ultimately going to be able to show you in terms of content mastery and skill development at the end of this project.
Okay. Once you have that, that big rubric, then what is the next step?
Yeah, so it's super, teachers get really overwhelmed when they see that on. And so I have to remind them, like, whoa, we're never going to use this in its entirety, first of all. Second of all, a child will never see this. So that usually helps people take like a sigh of relief.
Mm-hmm.
So then what we do is we figure out, okay, which rows of the rubric map onto which benchmarks of the project. Mm-hmm. So when teachers are designing those benchmarks, I always have them come up with a deliverable. That deliverable, that concrete thing that students are going to turn in for the project, right? In this case, it was like the 2-voice poetry or the infographic. Mm-hmm. That then gets assessed using the rows on the rubric that pertain to that deliverable.
Right.
So it's usually only going to be a rubric with like maybe 2, max 3 rows. And that feels more manageable.
I gotcha. So each deliverable has its own separate, smaller rubric that's just pulled a few items from that larger one.
Yeah, and the hope is that each row is used 2 times in the project. Okay. And the purpose for that is so that we have assessment for learning, not assessment of learning, right? So that students have a chance to get feedback, grow, and move over on the columns of the rubric by the time they're assessed a second time.
Okay, great. So once you've done the rubrics for those benchmarks, what happens after that?
Before that, I actually think it's probably important to point out too that I actually never graded the final necessarily. Like people ask, like, what do you use to grade the final? And it's like, well, I've already assessed the content and skills at least 2 times leading up to the actual final product.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does, except that benchmark 3 and 5 in this case are the final products. So
yes,
when they get assessed, right?
They do. Sometimes when we design, though, it doesn't always turn out like that. Sometimes it'll actually grade like, let's say you're grading like speaking and listening skills, and the students are going to be pitching your city council. Okay. You don't assess at city council, right? Okay. You assess in like a simulation in the classroom or something. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's still kind of formative assessment, I guess, when you compare it to the final product, but you're still assessing them on those skills.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we've just completed step 5, which is to take that larger rubric and break it down into the smaller ones for the separate pieces. And so then what is step 6?
It is creating the student-facing rubric. So like I mentioned before, the students are never going to see this massive beast of a rubric. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't, especially for the younger grades, they wouldn't even be able to access the information that's on there, right? So creating student rubrics is really helpful, in particular for elementary grades. So We simply take each row of the teacher rubric. We're still working backwards. We take each row from that rubric
Mm-hmm.
and we turn the proficient standards into success criteria, which is just simply an I can statement. So, for example, I can explain the causes of the American Revolution with evidence. And we ask them to assess not yet, most of the time, or always.
Okay.
And some teachers will put like cute little emojis in there, a thumbs up, thumbs down, red light, yellow light, green light, or they'll just keep it blank and ask the students to write evidence in the box.
Mm-hmm.
The idea here is that students are self-assessing, reflecting, and that this becomes kind of the gateway for feedback from the teacher.
Okay. So they've got their own version of the rubrics now. You've got all your benchmarks laid out. You know how you're going to assess them, which is great backward design. And so then what is the final step basically before you start actually rolling on the project?
This is probably the step that feels most comfortable to teachers. It's calendaring.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like where they think through what every single day is going to look
Mm-hmm.
like of the
Mm-hmm.
project. And we, whenever I'm project coaching, we same thing, just use a Google
Mm-hmm.
document, and it becomes kind of like the project hub. So we just create a table and number the days of the month into the
Mm-hmm.
table, and we zoom out to zoom in. So we first talk about like, okay, about how many weeks is it going to take us for each of these benchmarks, and we'll just kind of put placeholders for each benchmark by the weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and then we go back in and drill down to the single days within each of the benchmarks. And then within the single days, we drill down one more step into differentiation and thinking through what we might need to modify, further scaffold within each day for different students' needs.
Okay.
And then teachers like to hyperlink everything. So then it becomes like this beautiful hub where everything is in one spot. You can collaborate with your colleagues. And then more importantly, it's done for you next
Yes.
time you want to run the project.
Right. You might just have to do a little bit of fine tuning maybe.
Yeah, like maybe a little bit here and there, but for the most part, the hard part, collecting all the resources, figuring out what workshops and what lessons, which mystery science lab you're going to run on what day,
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
of that is already planned out for you in
Mm-hmm.
there.
Okay. All right. And then it's just once it's in the calendar, then you start doing it.
Then it's go time. Yeah, and it does by no means like is that everything to run a project, but that is where I encourage teachers to start with it. Like at that point, your first time out the gate, yeah, go run it. Like see what happens, and then let's talk about more of the nuances related to student collaboration and agency and how to do a project launch and how to do field work. Like there's just so many layers to PBL, but I feel like these 7 steps get you to enough of a place where you can run it, and then those nuances become more like organic need to knows rather than overwhelming you out the gate with all of that information. Right. You'll miss it's too much to take in at first.
But I think this is such I mean, I did not ever really have a good grip on what a full PBL lesson looked like. And I know for me, I'm thinking, okay, there's some of this stuff that seems new and sort of like 21st century and authentic, end products. And then there's other stuff that's a little bit more familiar to traditional schooling. And so seeing how all those parts work together, I think it's really nice because I think most experienced teachers will see a plan like this and say, oh, okay, I'm not having to completely stretch and change every single thing I do. It's really taking what you do and moving it to the next level and combining things in different ways.
Exactly. And for teachers who are trained in UBD, it feels very familiar to them. Like it's kind of how their brain works. So they're like, oh, I could do this.
Yeah. Anything else, before we wrap up that you sort of were thinking that, maybe we need to give to people as a takeaway about trying this?
I would definitely encourage transparency with the home connection.
Okay.
Because I think for parents, this feels foreign to them. And when it feels, in the absence of information, we make things up. So I think just trying to communicate. So, in my book, there's a few examples of like parent letters home that teachers will send at the launch of the project. But I think even things like making your project calendar open to parents so that they can see what's going on, that learning is actually happening. Because I think that's a pretty big misunderstanding about PBL. When there aren't textbooks and like worksheets being sent home necessarily, they're like, how do we know you're learning?
Right.
So I can't encourage teachers enough. I know that it's one more thing to do, but I swear the more we communicate, the less we have to communicate. Like you'll find that you won't have to keep answering emails to parents' questions about the project process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is also doing an exhibition of some sort at the end of the project and bringing parents in so that they can see the process and see how learning maybe looked a little bit different and hear their kids talking about their learning. I think the more we can bring parents along, the more it truly becomes a community effort rather than kind of this more isolated thing.
Yeah. Jenny, where can people find you online so that they can continue to learn from you?
I try to be really active on social media, and by active I mean sharing resources to help teachers with this stuff. And it's really responsive to the questions that I'm hearing in the trenches with teachers. So ideas for projects, where I come up with ideas, or really cool resources I found. So I'm at crafted_Jenny P or Jenny Pieratt. And then I also have a website with a ton of information and a lot of free project ideas. That's craftedcurriculum.com.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for walking through this. I think it's really going to help teachers be able to visualize what a completed unit plan looks like and maybe try it themselves.
I hope so. Thank you for having me.
For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 139. To get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.